My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I was born on African soil, raised among people who understand struggle not from books, but from life itself. I know what it means to see poverty standing beside dignity. I know what it means to watch powerful nations speak about freedom while weaker nations continue to bleed. I know what silence feels like when truth becomes dangerous. Today I do not stand before you as a preacher. I do not come carrying religion like a weapon, and I do not come to force belief into the hearts of anyone listening to me. I come as a man searching for truth. And I come to speak about a truth that many people fear to discuss openly. The truth about Jesus Christ. For centuries the world has spoken his name, built monuments in his honor, and repeated his words in churches across continents. But somewhere along the road the image of Jesus became soft, distant, and controlled. The world accepted a version of Jesus that never disturbs power. A version that smiles but never confronts corruption. A version that comforts the rich while the poor continue to suffer outside the gates. But that is not the Jesus I discovered when I read his story with open eyes. As an African, I understand oppression. As a believer, I understand faith. And as a man responsible for leading a nation through difficult times, I understand courage. The Jesus I see in Scripture was not weak. He stood beside the forgotten. He defended the rejected. He challenged empires. He exposed hypocrisy without fear. That truth matters today more than ever, because millions of people around the world are still suffering under systems built on greed, fear, exploitation, and lies. And many of them have never been told who Jesus truly was. So tonight, I ask you to listen carefully, not to propaganda, not to politics, but to a story the powerful have tried very hard to reshape. A story about truth, a story about courage, a story about Jesus. When many people hear the name of Jesus, they imagine silence. They imagine a man who never raised his voice against power, a man who accepted injustice quietly, a man who walked through the world only speaking gentle words while evil continued to rule around him. That image has been repeated for generations, and I believe it was repeated for a reason, because a weak Jesus is comfortable for powerful people. A silent Jesus never threatens corrupt systems. A soft Jesus never frightens greedy leaders. A harmless Jesus can be displayed in grand buildings while the poor remain hungry outside. But when I read the gospel carefully, I do not see weakness. I see courage. I see a man who walked directly into the heart of corruption without fear. I see a revolutionary. Many people misunderstand the meaning of revolution. A revolution is not only about weapons or armies. Sometimes the most dangerous revolution begins with truth. Jesus carried truth into a world built on lies. That made him dangerous. He lived during the rule of the Roman Empire, one of the most powerful systems the world had ever known. Rome controlled nations through fear, violence, taxes, and military force. People obeyed because resistance often meant death. At the same time, religious leaders held enormous influence over society. Many ordinary people feared them as much as they feared political rulers. And in the middle of this system stood Jesus, a poor man from Nazareth. No palace, no army, no wealth, no political office, yet the powerful feared him. Why? Because truth frightens every system built on deception. Jesus spoke in ways that exposed the heart of corruption. He did not flatter the powerful. He did not change his message to protect himself. He did not speak only to educated elites while ignoring ordinary people. He walked among fishermen, laborers, widows, beggars, and the rejected. And he told them something dangerous. He told them they mattered. Do you understand how revolutionary that message was? Empires survive by convincing people they are small. Oppressive systems survive by teaching the poor that they deserve suffering. But Jesus looked into the eyes of forgotten people and declared that they carried value. Not because of money, not because of status, not because of race or power, but because they were human beings created by God. That message alone threatened the entire structure of oppression. And the deeper I think about it, the more I understand why the authorities wanted him silenced. Because once oppressed people rediscover dignity, fear begins to break. I have seen this reality in Africa. For generations, many African nations were taught to doubt themselves. Colonialism did not only steal land, it attacked identity. People were told they were less intelligent, less civilized, less capable, less worthy. Even after colonialism officially ended, many systems continued teaching dependence. That is how oppression survives. First, it controls the body. Then it attempts to control the mind. Jesus fought against that kind of spiritual slavery. He reminded people that no empire owns the human soul. That is why his words still carry power centuries later. But there is another side of Jesus many people avoid discussing: his anger. Modern society often accepts the love of Jesus but becomes uncomfortable with his righteous anger. Yet anger against injustice is not evil. There is a difference between hatred and moral courage. Jesus became angry when sacred things were turned into business. One of the clearest moments appears when he entered the temple and saw merchants exploiting worshippers for profit. The temple was supposed to be a place of prayer, humility, and connection with God. Instead, corruption had entered it. Money controlled everything. The poor suffered while religious authorities benefited, and Jesus responded, not with silence, not with polite approval. He overturned the tables. He drove out the money changers. He exposed the hypocrisy openly in front of everyone. Imagine that moment carefully. This was not weakness. This was direct confrontation. And this is the Jesus many institutions prefer not to discuss too deeply, because that version of Jesus forces uncomfortable questions. What happens when religion becomes business? What happens when leaders use faith to enrich themselves while ordinary people struggle? What happens when sacred language is used to protect corruption? Jesus confronted all of it, fearlessly. That is why I say he was revolutionary. Not because he sought chaos, but because he challenged systems that crushed human dignity. Real revolution begins there. Not in hatred, not in revenge, but in truth. The world often praises peace while ignoring justice. But there can be no lasting peace without justice. A village may appear quiet while its people starve. A nation may appear stable while corruption destroys the future of its children. Silence is not always peace. Jesus understood that. That is why he refused to remain silent in the presence of hypocrisy. And hypocrisy surrounded him constantly. Religious leaders spoke holy words while lacking compassion. Political authorities claimed order while spreading fear. The wealthy protected their comfort while ignoring suffering. Jesus exposed all of them, not because he hated people, but because he loved truth. This distinction matters deeply. Many revolutions in history became consumed by bitterness. Some overthrew one form of oppression only to create another. But Jesus spoke about transformation of the heart. He challenged evil while still calling people toward repentance, mercy, and truth. Even those who betrayed him were offered forgiveness. That kind of strength is rare, and it is much harder than hatred. Anyone can become consumed by rage. But to stand firmly against corruption while refusing to lose your humanity requires extraordinary spiritual discipline. Jesus possessed that discipline. That is why his enemies could not fully understand him. They expected political rebellion in the traditional sense. Instead, he attacked the deeper roots of oppression: fear, greed, pride, hypocrisy, spiritual blindness. These forces still dominate much of the modern world. And that is why his message remains relevant today. Sometimes I look at global politics and I see the same patterns repeating. Powerful nations speaking about morality while exploiting weaker countries. Corporations accumulating unimaginable wealth while workers struggle to survive. Leaders speaking about freedom while silencing truth. The language changes. The technology changes. But human greed remains the same. And if Jesus walked through many modern institutions today, I believe he would still overturn tables. Not only in churches, but in places where profit is valued more than human life. He would confront systems that feed on war. Systems that profit from hunger. Systems that keep nations dependent while pretending to offer help. And once again, many powerful people would call him dangerous. History repeats itself. Because truth always disturbs those who benefit from lies. One thing that touches me deeply about Jesus is that he never chased comfort. Modern culture worships comfort. People are taught to avoid risk, avoid sacrifice, avoid standing alone. But truth often isolates those who speak it. Jesus understood this from the beginning. He knew confrontation with corrupt systems would eventually lead to suffering. Yet he continued. That courage inspires millions of people across the world, especially those who suffer injustice. In Africa, many young people feel forgotten by the international system. They see wealth leave their lands while poverty remains behind. They see resources extracted while communities stay underdeveloped. They ask themselves difficult questions. Why are some nations allowed dignity while others remain trapped in dependency? Why does corruption survive so easily? Why do powerful institutions speak about equality while practicing exploitation? These questions are not very different from the questions ordinary people asked during the time of Jesus. Oppression changes form, but not nature. And this is why the real story of Jesus matters. Because he reminds oppressed people that moral courage is possible. He reminds humanity that truth can survive even under enormous pressure. He reminds leaders that authority without justice becomes corruption. Most importantly, he reminds every forgotten person that they possess dignity no empire can erase. That message is revolutionary, not because it promotes violence, but because it destroys the psychological chains oppression depends upon. A slave who rediscovers dignity becomes harder to control. A citizen who recognizes truth becomes harder to manipulate. A believer who understands justice becomes harder to silence. That is why powerful systems throughout history have often tried to reshape Jesus into something passive and harmless. Because the true message of Jesus awakens people, and awakened people ask questions. They challenge corruption. They defend human dignity. They resist fear. This does not mean Jesus called for hatred or division. No, he called for courage, rooted in love and truth. And perhaps that is what made him most dangerous of all. Because violence can sometimes strengthen oppressive systems, but fearless truth exposes them. Even now, centuries later, governments rise and fall. Empires appear and disappear. Political ideologies change. Yet the story of Jesus continues moving through the hearts of ordinary people. Why? Because deep inside the human soul exists a hunger for justice, a hunger for truth, a hunger for dignity. And Jesus spoke directly to that hunger. That is why his words survive prisons, persecutions, wars, and centuries of manipulation. Truth survives, even when buried beneath power, even when distorted by institutions, even when feared by the world. And when I think about Jesus as a revolutionary, I do not think first about religion. I think about courage. The courage to stand before powerful systems without surrendering your soul. The courage to defend the weak. The courage to confront hypocrisy. The courage to speak truth even when truth becomes dangerous. That courage is needed today more than ever, because too many people have accepted a world where greed is normal and injustice is inevitable. But Jesus challenged inevitability. He challenged the belief that corruption must rule forever. And that is why his story still matters, not only to Christians, but to every person searching for dignity, justice, and truth in a wounded world. The revolutionary spirit of Jesus was never about domination. It was about liberation. Liberation from fear. Liberation from lies. Liberation from the systems that convince human beings they are powerless. And perhaps that is exactly why the world still struggles with the real truth about him. Because a truly awakened humanity is difficult to control. One of the greatest lies ever told about Jesus is the idea that he belonged to the powerful. Many people today imagine him surrounded by wealth, influence, and comfort. They imagine religion as something connected to authority, status, and grand institutions. But when I read the story of Jesus carefully, I see something completely different. I see a man who walked beside the poor, not for one day, not for public appearance, not to gain popularity. He lived among them. He understood their suffering because he himself came from humble conditions. Jesus was not born inside a palace. He was not raised among kings. He entered this world in simplicity, surrounded not by luxury but by struggle. That matters deeply, because from the beginning, his life carried a message. Human dignity does not come from wealth. The world often measures value through money, titles, and power, but Jesus challenged that thinking completely. He looked at people society considered worthless and treated them with honor. That was revolutionary then, and it remains revolutionary now. I sometimes think about the forgotten people of the world. The farmer who works endlessly yet remains poor. The widow abandoned by society. The child growing up without opportunity. The worker whose labor enriches others while his own family struggles to survive. These people are often invisible to the global system. Governments speak about economics. Corporations speak about growth. Leaders speak about progress, but millions still suffer quietly. Jesus never ignored those people. He moved toward them. That is one of the reasons his message spread so powerfully among ordinary people, because they recognized someone who truly saw them, not as numbers, not as tools, not as burdens, but as human beings. And I believe this is one of the truths the world has tried hardest to soften. Because when people truly understand that Jesus stood beside the oppressed, uncomfortable questions begin to emerge. If Jesus stood with the poor, then why do so many systems continue exploiting them? If Jesus defended the vulnerable, then why are vulnerable people still ignored even by institutions claiming to represent him? If Jesus valued human dignity above wealth, then why has greed become almost sacred in modern society? These questions disturb people because they force reflection, and reflection often threatens comfort. I remember reading about how Jesus treated those rejected by society. This is one of the most beautiful parts of his story. He touched people others avoided. In his time, some diseases caused individuals to become completely isolated from society. People feared them, avoided them, rejected them, but Jesus approached them without fear. Imagine what that meant emotionally. To spend years treated like a curse, years without human closeness, years feeling invisible. Then suddenly someone approaches you not with disgust, but with compassion. That changes the human spirit. And Jesus did this repeatedly, not only with the sick, but with everyone society pushed aside, women condemned publicly, tax collectors hated by communities, foreigners treated as inferior, the poor dismissed as unimportant. Jesus listened to them. In many cases, he defended them directly against public humiliation. One story has always stayed deeply in my mind, the story of the woman accused before a crowd ready to stone her. People gathered carrying judgment in their hands. They wanted punishment. They wanted spectacle. They wanted someone to condemn. And Jesus stood between the vulnerable person and the violence of the crowd. That moment reveals something powerful about human nature. Crowds often enjoy condemnation. Societies sometimes unite more easily around hatred than compassion. Even today, people destroy one another publicly with frightening speed, especially in the modern age of media and technology. One accusation, one mistake, one moment of weakness, then millions rush forward with judgment. But Jesus interrupted that cycle. He forced the crowd to examine themselves before condemning another human being. That required courage, because mercy is often unpopular. The world frequently mistakes cruelty for strength. But Jesus demonstrated another kind of strength, the strength to protect dignity. That lesson matters enormously today, particularly for nations and communities suffering oppression, because oppressed people are often denied dignity long before they are denied resources. The world humiliates them first. Colonial systems understood this very well. They did not simply take land. They attacked identity, culture, confidence, self-worth. Many Africans grew up under systems designed to make them doubt their own value. Even today, many nations continue fighting psychological chains left behind by generations of exploitation. That is why the message of Jesus speaks so strongly to many people across Africa, because he restored dignity to those the world considered unimportant. And dignity changes everything. When a child believes he has value, he begins imagining a future. When a nation rediscovers dignity, it begins resisting exploitation. When oppressed people recognize their humanity, fear weakens. Jesus understood this deeply. That is why he spent so much time among ordinary people, not because he hated the wealthy, but because the poor were the ones most crushed by injustice. And injustice was always one of his greatest concerns. I think many modern societies have become uncomfortable discussing economic injustice honestly. People prefer charity without transformation. They prefer temporary relief instead of confronting systems creating suffering. But Jesus often went deeper than charity. He exposed greed itself. He warned repeatedly about the spiritual danger of worshiping wealth, not because money itself is evil, but because greed destroys compassion. A society obsessed with profit eventually begins treating human beings like objects. We can see this clearly in the modern world. Workers exhausted while corporations grow richer. Communities displaced for resources. Nations destabilized for economic interests. Children starving while enormous wealth accumulates elsewhere. And then the world calls this normal. Jesus never accepted exploitation as normal. That is one reason many powerful groups feared him, because he revealed the moral emptiness hiding beneath external success. Some people misunderstand his message entirely. They think standing with the poor means promoting hatred against successful people. No. Jesus did not preach envy. He preached responsibility. He challenged those with power to use it with justice and compassion. He reminded humanity that wealth without morality becomes dangerous. And history proves this repeatedly. Entire civilizations collapse when greed becomes stronger than conscience. That truth applies not only to individuals but also to nations. A powerful country without moral responsibility becomes a threat to weaker nations. A corporation without conscience becomes exploitation. A leader without compassion becomes tyranny. Jesus warned humanity about all these dangers through his teachings and actions. Yet many institutions reduced his message into simple rituals disconnected from real life. People memorize verses while ignoring suffering around them. They pray publicly while exploiting workers privately. They speak about morality while supporting systems destroying human dignity. Jesus confronted this hypocrisy constantly. And if we are honest, hypocrisy still dominates much of the world today. I have often wondered how Jesus would react if he walked through certain parts of the modern world. Would he remain silent while children die from hunger beside enormous luxury? Would he ignore corruption draining resources from poor nations? Would he approve of systems where a small number of people possess unimaginable wealth while millions cannot survive with dignity? I do not believe so, because the Jesus I see in Scripture consistently moved toward suffering, not away from it. That is important. Many people move toward power because power provides comfort and protection. But Jesus moved toward pain, toward brokenness, toward rejection, toward people society preferred not to see. And perhaps that is what made his love so powerful. It was not selective. It crossed social boundaries, ethnic boundaries, economic boundaries, political boundaries. That was radical in his time. And honestly, it remains radical now. The modern world still divides human beings constantly. Race, religion, nationality, class, ideology. People are trained to fear one another. But Jesus repeatedly destroyed those barriers. He spoke with people others considered untouchable. He elevated those society pushed downward. He listened where others ignored. And he did all this while confronting systems profiting from division. I believe oppressed people recognize authenticity quickly. They know when someone truly stands beside them and when someone only performs compassion publicly. That is why ordinary people followed Jesus in such large numbers. Not because he promised wealth or comfort, but because he treated them like human beings. That kind of respect can transform lives. Sometimes the greatest form of healing is being seen, being heard, being told your life matters. The world often speaks about the poor without ever listening to them. Policies are written far away from suffering. Decisions are made by people untouched by consequences. Jesus was different. He entered directly into the lives of ordinary people. He ate with them, walked with them, wept with them. That human closeness matters deeply, especially today when many societies feel emotionally disconnected despite technological connection. People communicate constantly but still feel unseen. Millions feel abandoned by political systems, economic systems, and even religious institutions. And perhaps this is why the message of Jesus still resonates so strongly, because deep inside human beings are searching not only for survival, but for dignity, for meaning, for compassion, for justice. Jesus offered all of these, not as abstract ideas, but through action. That is why his story survived centuries, because people recognized truth inside it. The oppressed recognized someone who understood suffering. The forgotten recognized someone who remembered them. The rejected recognized someone who refused to abandon them. And even now, that truth remains alive. Across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and poor communities everywhere, countless people still hold on to the image of Jesus standing beside the suffering. Not because life is easy, but because his example gives moral strength, strength to continue, strength to resist despair, strength to believe human dignity still matters even in a brutal world. That hope is powerful. And powerful systems often fear hope, because hopeless people are easier to control. A person without hope eventually accepts humiliation. A nation without hope eventually accepts exploitation. But Jesus restored hope constantly. Not cheap optimism, real hope rooted in dignity and truth. And that hope created courage inside ordinary people. The world today desperately needs that courage again. We need leaders who value people above greed. We need institutions that protect dignity instead of exploiting weakness. We need communities that remember compassion instead of worshiping power. And we need the real message of Jesus. Not the comfortable version created to protect systems, but the living truth of a man who stood beside the poor, defended the rejected, and reminded humanity that every life possesses sacred value. That message is not ancient. It is alive. Every time someone protects the vulnerable instead of exploiting them, that spirit lives. Every time a nation fights for dignity instead of surrendering to fear, that spirit lives. Every time a human being chooses compassion over cruelty, that spirit lives. That is why the truth about Jesus cannot disappear completely, because truth survives wherever justice survives. And the poor of the world still remember who truly stood beside them. There is something the world rarely discusses honestly. The image of Jesus presented to many people today is often incomplete, not entirely false, but carefully softened. Certain parts of his message are repeated constantly while other parts are hidden in silence. The world kept his smile, but buried his fire. And I believe this happened because the real Jesus is difficult for corrupt systems to control. A Jesus who only speaks about personal comfort creates no threat. A Jesus disconnected from justice creates no challenge. A Jesus transformed into a passive symbol becomes useful for maintaining power. But the true story of Jesus is far more dangerous than many institutions are willing to admit. Because he did not simply comfort people, he awakened them. And awakened people begin questioning the world around them. That is exactly what powerful systems fear. Throughout history, many governments understood that religion could either challenge oppression or protect it. If faith encourages courage, dignity, and truth, it becomes dangerous to corrupt rulers. But if faith is reduced to empty ritual and blind obedience, it becomes easier to manage. This is not new. History is filled with examples of spiritual teachings being reshaped to serve political and economic interests. Sometimes truth is not destroyed directly. Sometimes it is diluted slowly, little by little, until people forget its original power. I believe this happened with the image of Jesus in many parts of the world. The revolutionary became harmless. The defender of the poor became disconnected from justice. The man who challenged corruption became a decorative figure placed safely inside institutions. And many people accepted this version without questioning it. But the deeper I read scripture, the more impossible it becomes for me to ignore the contradiction. The Jesus described in the gospel confronted systems constantly. He exposed hypocrisy publicly. He defended the vulnerable openly. He challenged greed fearlessly. That kind of person cannot easily be controlled. So over centuries, many institutions emphasized only the parts of his message that maintained social comfort. They spoke about heaven but avoided discussing injustice on earth. They encouraged prayer while discouraging resistance against corruption. They preached obedience but remained silent about exploitation. And eventually many believers inherited a version of faith disconnected from courage. That is one of the greatest tragedies in modern spiritual life. Because true faith should strengthen moral responsibility, not weaken it. Jesus never taught people to become passive in the presence of evil. He taught courage rooted in truth and compassion. But systems benefiting from inequality often prefer passive populations, especially populations trained never to question authority. I have seen this dynamic not only in religion but also in politics. Power survives most easily when people stop asking difficult questions. When citizens fear truth. When communities become emotionally exhausted, when injustice becomes normalized. That is why controlling narratives is so important to powerful institutions. If you control the story, you influence how people think. And if you influence how people think, you influence what they are willing to accept. For centuries, colonized nations experienced this reality directly. Africa was not only conquered through weapons, it was also manipulated through narratives. People were taught distorted versions of themselves. Distorted versions of history, distorted versions of their own value. And whenever people lose connection to truth, they become easier to dominate. The same principle applies spiritually. If the image of Jesus becomes disconnected from justice, then faith loses transformative power. It becomes ritual without awakening. And I believe many people feel this emptiness today. They attend religious ceremonies yet still feel spiritually hungry. They hear moral language yet continue witnessing greed and corruption everywhere around them. Why? Because words without truth eventually become hollow. Jesus warned about this constantly. He criticized religious leaders who appeared righteous publicly while remaining morally corrupt internally. That criticism remains relevant now. Some institutions speak beautifully about love while protecting exploitation. Some leaders quote scripture while ignoring suffering. Some organizations present morality publicly while participating privately in systems harming vulnerable people. Jesus confronted exactly this kind of hypocrisy. And hypocrisy always fears exposure. That is why truth becomes dangerous. Because truth removes masks. One thing I have noticed in the modern world is how often image matters more than reality. Governments invest heavily in public appearance. Corporations spend enormous resources shaping perception. Public figures carefully manage how they are seen. But Jesus cared far more about reality than appearance. He repeatedly exposed the difference between external performance and internal truth. A society may appear successful while millions suffer invisibly. A religious institution may appear holy while lacking compassion. A leader may appear strong while serving corruption. Jesus looked beneath appearances. That is why his message disturbed comfortable people. Because he forced moral examination. And moral examination threatens systems built on illusion. The world reacts to harmless symbols compared to living truth. A symbol can be celebrated without changing anything. People can display religious language publicly while continuing unjust behavior privately. But living truth demands transformation. It demands honesty. It demands courage. and many systems resist that demand. So instead of destroying Jesus completely, the world often reshaped him into something safer, something less disruptive, something that comforts without confronting. But the real Jesus confronted constantly. He confronted greed. He confronted hypocrisy. He confronted exploitation. He confronted spiritual arrogance. And because of this, he became deeply threatening to establish power. There is another important truth many people avoid discussing. The suffering of Jesus was political as well as spiritual. The authorities did not execute him simply because he spoke about kindness. They feared his influence. Crowds followed him because ordinary people recognized authenticity. And whenever oppressed people begin gathering around truth, powerful systems become nervous. History proves this repeatedly. Authentic moral voices often become targets, not because they seek violence, but because they expose corruption. Corrupt systems can survive criticism for a while. What they fear most is awakening, because awakening spreads. One courageous voice inspires another. One act of truth weakens fear. One refusal to submit psychologically can influence entire communities. That is why many powerful institutions throughout history worked hard to control spiritual narratives. A spiritually awakened population is difficult to manipulate, and Jesus awakened people deeply. He reminded them that no empire is greater than truth. No authority is above moral responsibility. No human being loses value because society rejects them. These ideas remain powerful today, perhaps even more powerful now, because modern systems possess enormous technological influence. People are surrounded constantly by information, distraction, propaganda, and emotional manipulation. Truth becomes harder to recognize. And in this confusion, many people become spiritually numb. They stop questioning, stop reflecting, stop resisting injustice. That numbness benefits corrupt systems enormously. A distracted population rarely challenges exploitation effectively. But Jesus interrupted numbness. He forced people to see. That is one reason his parables were so powerful. They revealed hidden truths about human nature and society. They exposed greed hiding beneath respectability, fear hiding beneath authority, pride hiding beneath religion. And even now, those same problems continue shaping the modern world. I believe one of the greatest dangers today is the commercialization of spirituality. Faith becomes business. Hope becomes product. Religion becomes performance. People sell inspiration while ignoring suffering. They build enormous platforms while ordinary communities remain broken. Jesus warned humanity about this long ago. He understood that spiritual corruption is especially dangerous because it manipulates the deepest parts of human trust. When political systems fail, people may still search for moral guidance. But when spiritual institutions lose integrity, despair grows deeper. That is why preserving truth matters so much. Not only political truth, spiritual truth, moral truth, human truth, and the truth about Jesus belongs in that category, because his story was never meant to support greed or domination. It was meant to challenge them. Sometimes I wonder how different the world might look if the true revolutionary spirit of Jesus had remained central throughout history. What if nations truly valued human dignity above profit? What if leaders understood authority as responsibility rather than privilege? What if religion consistently defended the oppressed instead of protecting power? Perhaps many wars could have been avoided. Perhaps exploitation would have weakened. Perhaps millions would have suffered less. Of course, human beings remain imperfect. Greed, fear, and pride exist in every generation. But truth still matters. Because truth gives humanity direction. Without truth, power becomes the only law. And whenever power becomes the highest value, the weak suffer first. Jesus opposed exactly this mentality. He reminded humanity that moral responsibility stands above domination, compassion above greed, truth above image, justice above comfort. That message remains revolutionary, and perhaps that is why it was softened over time. Because comfortable societies often fear uncomfortable truths. People enjoy spirituality that reassures them, but transformation requires confrontation. A doctor who hides illness cannot heal a patient, and a society that hides moral corruption cannot heal itself. Jesus revealed humanity's moral sickness openly, not to destroy people, but to awaken them. There is a difference. The purpose of truth is not humiliation, it is liberation. But liberation begins painfully because it requires honesty. Honesty about corruption, honesty about greed, honesty about injustice, honesty about ourselves. That is why many people resist truth initially. Truth removes excuses. And systems built on excuses cannot survive exposure forever. Even today, I believe millions of people hunger for authenticity. They are tired of performance, tired of manipulation, tired of institutions saying beautiful words while reality grows darker. And this is why the real image of Jesus still carries power. Because authenticity cannot be completely erased. The poor still recognize his compassion. The oppressed still recognize his courage. The seekers of truth still recognize his honesty. Even after centuries of distortion, something real continues shining through his story. And that truth continues threatening systems built on lies. Because the moment human beings rediscover moral courage, fear begins losing control. The moment people rediscover dignity, exploitation weakens. The moment societies value truth above propaganda, corruption becomes vulnerable. That is why preserving the real message of Jesus matters far beyond religion itself. It matters for humanity, for justice, for the future of nations, for the dignity of ordinary people. The world may continue trying to reshape truth into something convenient, but living truth always resists imprisonment. And the real spirit of Jesus remains alive wherever human beings stand against hypocrisy, defend dignity, and refuse to surrender their conscience to corrupt systems. That spirit cannot be buried permanently, because truth survives even when the world fears it. Many people say they love Jesus. Governments mention him in speeches. Politicians quote his words during campaigns. Religious institutions display his image proudly. But sometimes I ask myself a difficult question. If the real Jesus walked into the modern world today, would these same systems truly accept him? Or would they fear him exactly as the authorities feared him centuries ago? The more I study human history, the more I believe the answer is painful. I believe many of the same forces that opposed Jesus in the past would oppose him again now. Because corruption changes clothing, but not character. Greed evolves, empires evolve, technology evolves. But the human desire to dominate, exploit, and silence truth remains frighteningly constant. Imagine for a moment that Jesus suddenly appeared in a poor neighborhood instead of a palace. Imagine him walking through forgotten villages in Africa, through refugee camps, through neighborhoods destroyed by war, through communities abandoned by global wealth. Do you think powerful people would celebrate him immediately? I am not so sure. Because the real Jesus would not remain silent. He would speak about injustice. He would ask why nations rich in natural resources still suffer poverty. He would ask why children starve while enormous wealth exists elsewhere. He would ask why wars continue generating profit for certain industries. He would ask why corruption steals the future from ordinary people. And those questions would make many powerful institutions deeply uncomfortable. That is exactly what happened during his lifetime. The authorities did not fear Jesus because he preached kindness. They feared him because truth was gathering people around him. Truth has gravity. It pulls wounded people toward hope. And systems built on fear always become nervous when hope begins spreading among the oppressed. Today, the world speaks constantly about freedom. But many truths remain dangerous to speak openly. Journalists disappear. Whistleblowers are punished. Activists are silenced. Nations resisting exploitation face enormous pressure. Power still protects itself aggressively. And I believe Jesus would confront this reality directly. Not diplomatically. Directly. Because truth without courage becomes decoration. One thing I admire deeply about Jesus is that he never adjusted truth merely to protect his popularity. Modern culture worships popularity. People fear criticism more than dishonesty. Many leaders say what audiences want to hear instead of what conscience demands. But Jesus spoke truth even when crowds abandoned him afterward. That kind of integrity is rare and dangerous, especially in a world increasingly controlled by image and public perception. Today, entire reputations can be destroyed within hours. Media systems shape narratives constantly. Corporations influence public opinion. Political institutions manage information carefully. In such a world, a figure like Jesus would threaten established control immediately. Why? Because authentic truth cannot be fully managed. Imagine Jesus criticizing corruption publicly today. Some media organizations would likely label him extreme. Political groups would attempt to use him for their own agendas. Corporations would try to commercialize his image. And powerful institutions threatened by his words would begin portraying him as dangerous. History repeats itself. Not perfectly, but consistently. The same world that praises dead prophets often rejects living truth. It is easier to honor courage after it no longer threatens current systems. That is why many historical figures become celebrated only after their voices can no longer disrupt power directly. During their lives, they are attacked. After death, they are memorialized. Jesus experienced exactly this pattern, and I believe he would experience it again, especially because modern systems possess extraordinary influence. Surveillance, mass communication, economic pressure, political alliances. The ability to shape perception globally has never been greater than it is now. Yet despite all this power, one thing remains difficult to control completely: human conscience. That is why truth still frightens corrupt systems, because even one honest voice can awaken millions. Jesus understood this deeply. He knew transformation begins inside the human spirit, not merely through institutions. That is why he focused so much on conscience, on integrity, on moral courage. And those qualities remain deeply threatening to systems built on manipulation. I sometimes think about how Jesus would speak about modern inequality. Would he remain silent while multinational corporations extract enormous wealth from struggling regions? Would he ignore political corruption destroying public trust? Would he avoid speaking about war, exploitation, and human suffering because these topics are controversial? No. The Jesus I know from Scripture walked directly toward uncomfortable truths. That is precisely why powerful groups considered him dangerous, because he refused compromise with hypocrisy. And hypocrisy remains one of the strongest forces shaping the modern world. Nations speak about peace while selling weapons. Institutions speak about morality while protecting abuse. Corporations speak about responsibility while exploiting labor. The language sounds beautiful, but reality often tells another story. Jesus exposed this gap relentlessly. He forced people to confront the difference between appearance and truth, and people rarely enjoy that confrontation, because truth demands accountability. That is another reason I believe many systems would reject him today. Modern society often prefers distraction over reflection. Entertainment replaces contemplation. Noise replaces wisdom. Consumption replaces meaning. People are encouraged constantly to seek comfort, status, and pleasure. But Jesus consistently challenged attachment to materialism. He reminded humanity that gaining the world while losing the soul is not victory. Imagine speaking that message in today's world, a world obsessed with consumption, a world where human worth is often measured through possessions, influence, and visibility. Many would mock him, others would attempt to twist his message into something marketable, and some would feel deeply threatened, because truth always threatens industries built on emptiness. There is another reason the modern system would resist Jesus. He refused tribal hatred. This is important. The world today is deeply divided. Political divisions, religious divisions, ethnic divisions, national division. Many leaders gain power by feeding fear and anger. But Jesus consistently crossed boundaries. He spoke to outsiders, defended rejected people, humanized those society despised. That kind of moral courage disrupts systems dependent on division, because divided populations are easier to manipulate. Fear creates obedience. Hatred creates distraction. People fighting one another often fail to notice who benefits from their suffering. Jesus interrupted this cycle repeatedly. He reminded humanity of shared dignity, and shared dignity weakens systems built on dehumanization. I think this truth is especially important for Africa and the developing world. Too often, nations suffering exploitation are divided internally through ethnic conflict, political manipulation, or foreign influence. Division weakens resistance. Jesus understood that human beings must recognize one another's humanity before justice becomes possible. That lesson remains urgent today. But unfortunately, many modern systems profit from conflict. War creates economic opportunities for some industries. Instability creates political advantages for certain powers. Fear increases public dependence on authority. In such a world, a voice calling humanity back toward truth and dignity becomes disruptive. And disruption attracts hostility. One of the saddest realities in history is that people often reject the very truth they claim to seek. Why? Because truth requires sacrifice. It requires humility. It requires change. Many people admire courage from a distance but fear practicing it personally. Jesus demanded more than admiration. He called people toward transformation. And transformation threatens comfort. If Jesus appeared today speaking against greed, corruption, exploitation, and moral hypocrisy, many people would initially celebrate him emotionally, until his message challenged their own interests. Then resistance would begin. That is human nature. We prefer truths that accuse others while leaving ourselves untouched. But Jesus confronted everyone, the powerful, the religious, the wealthy, the crowd, even his own followers, because real truth does not belong to ideology. It belongs to conscience. And conscience often becomes inconvenient. Still, despite all resistance, I believe millions would recognize him instantly, not through appearance, but through spirit. The poor would recognize his compassion. The oppressed would recognize his courage. The seekers of justice would recognize his honesty, because authenticity carries a kind of light impossible to imitate completely. The world is starving for authenticity now. People are exhausted by propaganda, manipulation, and performance. Many no longer trust institutions fully because they see contradiction everywhere. And in this atmosphere, a truly authentic moral voice would shake society profoundly. That is exactly what Jesus did before. And that is what he would do again. Not through violence, but through truth powerful enough to expose moral emptiness. Some people misunderstand spiritual courage. They imagine it as softness. But spiritual courage is often stronger than force. Violence can control bodies temporarily. Truth can transform generations. That is why oppressive systems fear moral awakening so intensely. Because awakened people stop surrendering psychologically. They begin questioning fear, questioning propaganda, questioning systems normalizing injustice. Jesus awakened people this way, and modern systems would recognize the danger immediately. Still, despite all opposition, I believe his message would spread again. Why? Because human beings continue searching for meaning beyond material success. Even in wealthy societies, many people feel spiritually empty. Depression rise, isolation grows, distrust expands. The human soul cannot survive on consumption alone. It needs truth, purpose, dignity, compassion. Jesus spoke directly to these needs. That is why his message survived centuries of persecution, distortion, and political manipulation. And that is why it would survive again. The system may reject truth temporarily, but truth possesses endurance, corruption does not. Empires collapse, propaganda falhas, fear eventually weakens, but authentic moral courage leaves permanent marks on history. Jesus proved that a poor man without military power changed the world more deeply than many emperors. That fact alone terrifies systems obsessed with domination, because it reveals something important. True power is not always political. Sometimes true power is moral. The power to awaken conscience, the power to restore dignity, the power to speak truth despite fear. Jesus carried that power. And if he walked among us today, many powerful institutions would still fear him. Because the real Jesus does not serve corruption. He exposes it. One of the greatest misunderstandings about Jesus is the belief that his purpose was simply to make people feel comfortable. Many people today approach faith as a form of escape. They want reassurance without responsibility, peace without truth, hope without transformation. But when I study the life of Jesus, I see something far deeper. I see a man trying to awaken humanity, not entertain it, not sedate it, awaken it. An awakening is rarely comfortable. A sleeping person often resists being shaken awake, especially when the dream feels easier than reality. That is exactly what happens spiritually in many societies. People become accustomed to systems built on greed, fear, and injustice. After some time, corruption begins to feel normal. The human conscience falls asleep slowly, not all at once. Little compromises, little silences, little acts of selfishness repeated every day, until entire societies begin accepting things that should horrify them. Children starving beside enormous wealth, wars treated like business opportunities, human dignity sacrificed for profit, truth manipulated constantly for political advantage, and many people continue living as if this is simply the natural order of the world. Jesus came to interrupt that sleep. That is why his words often sounded sharp. People sometimes focus only on his gentle moments and ignore how directly he challenged moral laziness. He warned against hypocrisy, against greed, against pride, against indifference towards suffering. He confronted not only public corruption, but also the hidden darkness inside the human heart. That makes his message deeply uncomfortable, because it forces self-examination, and self-examination is difficult. It is easier to blame governments, corporations, and institutions for everything. Certainly, many systems are corrupt. But Jesus also reminded humanity that evil survives through individual choices repeated across generations. Fear repeated, greed repeated, silence repeated. A society does not become unjust accidentally. Human beings create unjust systems through moral compromise. That is why Jesus focused so heavily on conscience, because political change without moral awakening often fails. History proves this repeatedly. Some revolutions removed one oppressor only to create another. Some nations gained independence while corruption remained alive internally. Why? Because external freedom alone is not enough. Human beings must also confront the corruption inside themselves. Jesus understood this deeply. That is why his message was not merely political. It was spiritual and moral. He wanted people to wake up to truth. Truth about society, truth about power, truth about human dignity, and truth about themselves. Many people rejected him because awakening threatens comfort. Comfort is powerful. Human beings naturally seek security and stability. There is nothing wrong with peace. But peace without truth becomes dangerous. Because comfortable societies often ignore suffering happening elsewhere. I sometimes look at the modern world and see enormous moral numbness. People witness tragedy constantly through screens until suffering begins feeling distant. Wars become headlines. Starvation becomes statistics. Corruption becomes routine. The human heart slowly loses sensitivity. Jesus fought against exactly this kind of spiritual blindness. He reminded people to see one another again, to recognize suffering, to recognize responsibility, to recognize that human beings are connected morally whether they accept it or not. This message remains deeply important today, especially in an age dominated by distraction. Modern society is full of noise, constant entertainment, constant information, constant émotionnelle stimulation. But beneath all this noise, many people feel empty. Why? Because distraction is not meaning. Consumption is not purpose. Comfort is not fulfillment. The human soul needs truth. And truth sometimes hurts before it heals. Jesus understood this. That is why he refused to offer cheap comfort disconnected from reality. He comforted the suffering, yes, but he also challenged complacency, especially among those benefiting from injustice. One of the most dangerous spiritual conditions is indifference. A person who no longer cares about truth becomes easy to manipulate. A society that stops caring about justice eventually collapses morally. Jesus warned humanity against this kind of spiritual death. And this is one reason powerful systems often prefer a softer version of his message. A message focused only on personal comfort creates passive populations. But awakening creates courage. And courage changes history. Throughout the world today, many people live in fear. Fear of losing jobs, fear of speaking honestly, fear of challenging authority, fear of rejection, fear of isolation. Fear controls countless lives silently. Jesus challenged fear constantly. Not because fear disappears magically, but because truth becomes more important than fear. That lesson transformed many of his followers. Ordinary people gained extraordinary courage after encountering his message. Some faced persecution, some faced imprisonment, some faced death. Yet they continued speaking. Why? Because awakened conscience becomes difficult to silence permanently. I believe humanity desperately needs that courage now. Too many people know truth internally, yet remain silent publicly. Too many witness injustice but say nothing because silence feels safer. Too many compromise moral principles for comfort or advantage. Jesus called humanity toward something higher, toward integrity, toward moral responsibility, toward empathy be rooted in love instead of hatred. That distinction matters deeply, because awakening does not mean becoming consumed by anger. Some people hear words like justice and immediately think of revenge. But Jesus never taught revenge as the solution. He taught truth combined with compassion, strength combined with mercy, courage combined with humanity. That balance is difficult, much more difficult than hatred. Hatred is easy. Blaming others completely is easy. But true awakening requires humility as well as courage. It requires recognizing both personal and societal responsibility. And many people resist this because it demands transformation. Transformation always costs something. Sometimes comfort, sometimes reputation, sometimes relationships, sometimes security. Jesus never hid this reality. He told people clearly that truth carries consequences. Yet he also showed that a life built entirely around comfort eventually becomes spiritually empty. I think many people in the modern world are beginning to feel this emptiness deeply. Despite technological advancement, anxiety grows. Despite material abundance in some societies, loneliness increases. Despite endless entertainment, despair spreads. Why? Because human beings were not created merely to consume. They were created to live with meaning. And meaning requires truth, purpose, connection, morale direction. Jesus offered all these things, but he offered them through awakening, not sedation. He challenged people to see the world differently, to see the poor differently, to see enemies differently, to see power differently, to see themselves differently. That kind of awakening threatens systems dependent on unconscious obedience. Because awakened people begin asking questions. Why does injustice continue? Why is greed celebrated? Why are vulnerable people abandoned? Why do institutions say one thing while doing another? These questions are dangerous because they expose contradiction. And systems built on contradiction fear honest examination. That is why awakening is revolutionary. Not because it creates chaos, but because it destroys illusions. Jesus destroyed illusions constantly. The illusion that wealth equals moral superiority. The illusion that religious appearance equals righteousness. The illusion that political power equals truth. The illusion that human dignity can be measured by status. He stripped these illusions away one by one. And many people hated him for it. Because illusions can become emotionally comfortable, especially when they benefit us. Even today, many societies survive on illusion. The illusion that endless consumption creates happiness. The illusion that domination creates security. The illusion that human worth depends on success. But beneath these illusions, millions suffer emotionally and spiritually. Jesus addressed the deeper hunger beneath material life. A hunger for meaning. A hunger for truth. A hunger for dignity that money alone cannot satisfy. That is why his message continues crossing generations and cultures. Because the human soul has not changed as much as technology has. People still fear, still hope, still search for purpose, still long for justice. And Jesus spoke directly into those human realities. One thing I find especially powerful is that Jesus never awakened people through humiliation. He spoke hard truths, yes, but always with the possibility of transformation. He believed people could change. That matters enormously, because hopelessness destroys societies. When people stop believing transformation is possible, corruption becomes permanent. But Jesus insisted that change remains possible. For individuals, for communities, for a nation. That hope is not weakness, it is strength, especially in difficult times. Africa understands difficult times. Colonialism, exploitation, conflict, economic pressure. Yet despite all this, the spirit of many African people remains alive because hope survives. And hope survives because dignity survives. Jesus strengthened that dignity wherever he went. He reminded broken people they were not forgotten. He reminded oppressed people they were not worthless. He reminded humanity that truth matters even when powerful systems reject it. That message still awakens people now. Across the world, countless ordinary men and women continue standing for justice because something inside them refuses surrender. That spirit matters. Because history changes when conscience awakens collectively. Not instantly, but gradually. One courageous voice inspires another. One act of integrity spreads quietly. One refusal to accept corruption weakens fear. Jesus understood the power of awakened conscience. That is why his message still survives despite centuries of distortion, persecution, and political manipulation. Truth endures because the human soul recognizes it, even when society tries to bury it beneath distraction and propaganda. And perhaps this is why the message of Jesus remains dangerous today, because it calls human beings to wake up morally, spiritually, socially, to stop accepting lies simply because they are repeated constantly, to stop surrendering dignity for comfort, to stop confusing success with righteousness. The message of Jesus was never designed to make humanity spiritually asleep. It was meant to awaken courage, awaken compassion, awaken truth. And awakened people become difficult to control. There is one lesson history repeats again and again. Truth can be attacked. Truth can be distorted. Truth can be delayed. But truth cannot be buried forever. Empires have tried. Powerful institutions have tried. Corrupt leaders have tried. Violent systems have tried. Yet somehow, truth continues rising again through ordinary human beings. That is exactly what happened with the message of Jesus. For centuries, people attempted to reshape him, silence him, commercialize him, and control his image. But despite everything, the deeper truth survived. Why? Because real truth does not live only inside books or institutions. It lives inside conscience. It lives inside every human being who refuses to surrender completely to fear, greed, and hatred. That is why the Spirit of Jesus remains alive even now. Not merely in churches, not merely in ceremonies, but wherever human dignity is defended, wherever truth is spoken courageously, wherever compassion survives in a cruel world. Many people expected the message of Jesus to disappear long ago. After wars, after persecution, after corruption inside religious institutions, after centuries of political manipulation, yet it remains alive across continents, cultures, and generations. That itself says something important. Because lies often require constant force to survive, truth possesses endurance. Truth survives because the human soul recognizes it instinctively. Especially suffering people. The poor recognize authentic compassion. The oppressed recognize moral courage. The forgotten recognize someone who truly sees them. That is why the message of Jesus continues touching millions despite all human attempts to distort it. And I believe this matters deeply in our present moment. Because the modern world is spiritually exhausted. People are surrounded by technology yet feel disconnected. Surrounded by information yet uncertain what is true. Surrounded by consumption yet emotionally empty. Many societies are losing moral direction. You can feel it. Distrust grows everywhere. People distrust governments, distrust institutions, distrust media, sometimes even distrust one another. Why? Because human beings instinctively know when truth is missing. A society can possess enormous wealth and still feel spiritually broken. Without truth, prosperity alone cannot heal humanity. Jesus understood this long before modern civilization existed. That is why his message focused so much on the human heart. Because every system humanity creates eventually reflects the moral condition of people themselves. Corrupt hearts create corrupt institutions. Fearful hearts create oppressive societies. Greedy hearts create exploitation. But courageous hearts can also transform history. Jesus believed this. That is why he invested so deeply in ordinary people. Fishermen, workers, women ignored by society, the poor, the rejected. He understood that transformation often begins from places the world overlooks. And this truth gives me hope for Africa. Because for too long, Africa has been described mainly through suffering, poverty, conflict, dependency. But Africa also carries extraordinary spiritual strength, resilience, community, human warmth, faith that survives hardship. And I believe the spirit of truth remains alive strongly among ordinary African people because suffering often strips away illusion. People who struggle understand reality differently. They understand dignity differently. They understand dependence on God differently. The same was true during the life of Jesus. Many comfortable elites rejected him, but ordinary people recognized something authentic in him. Not perfection in appearance, authenticity in spirit. That authenticity still matters more than ever today. Because the world is drowning in performance, political performance, religious performance, social performance, everyone carefully shaping images, but human beings are starving for something real. And the message of Jesus remains real because it speaks directly to eternal human struggles. Fear, hope, suffering, justice, forgiveness, dignity, truth. These realities never disappear. Technology changes, but the human soul remains human. That is why the words of Jesus continue surviving generation after generation. Not because institutions are powerful enough to preserve them artificially, but because conscience keeps rediscovering them. Even in dark times, history contains many dark periods. Wars, colonialism, slavery, genocide, corruption. Yet even in those moments, there were always human beings who carried light. People who defended dignity despite danger. People who protected others despite fear. People who spoke truth despite consequences. I believe the Spirit of Jesus lived inside those acts. Because his message was never merely about religion as identity. It was about moral awakening, living truth, living compassion, living courage. And no system can fully erase those things from humanity. Sometimes truth survives quietly before it rises again publicly. A mother teaching dignity to her child during hardship. A man refusing corruption even when surrounded by it. A woman defending the vulnerable despite personal risk. A community sharing what little it has with those suffering. These moments may seem small to the world, but spiritually, they are enormous. because every act of human dignity pushes back against darkness. Jesus understood the power of small acts rooted in truth. The modern world often worships spectacle, big numbers, big power, big influence, but many of the greatest transformations in history began quietly, inside conscience, inside ordinary lives. The teachings of Jesus spread first among powerless people, yet eventually they reached the entire world. Why? Because truth travels differently than propaganda. Propaganda forces obedience through fear. Truth awakens recognition. Deep inside, people recognize moral honesty when they encounter it. That recognition cannot be fully controlled forever. And that is why I believe no empire can permanently bury the truth about Jesus. They can distort it temporarily, commercialize it temporarily, use it politically temporarily, but eventually humanity rediscovers the deeper message again. The message of courage, the message of dignity, the message that human beings matter more than greed, that justice matters more than power, that compassion matters more than domination. This is why I say the revolution Jesus began is still alive. Not a revolution of hatred, not a revolution of revenge, but a revolution of conscience. And conscience frightens corrupt systems because conscience cannot always be purchased. A person with awakened conscience may stand alone against enormous pressure. History proves this repeatedly. One truthful voice can inspire millions. One act of courage can break psychological chains. One refusal to surrender morally can change the future. Jesus demonstrated this power perfectly. The Roman Empire appeared invincible, yet the empire disappeared. The message survived. That fact alone contains extraordinary meaning, because it reminds humanity that force is not the highest form of power. Truth is stronger than fear over time. Love is stronger than hatred over time. Human dignity is stronger than oppression over time. Not always immediately, but ultimately. This is difficult for many people to believe during painful periods of history, especially when corruption appears victorious. I understand that feeling. Many nations understand that feeling. Africa understands that feeling. To struggle for dignity while powerful systems seem untouchable. To speak truth while propaganda dominates. To hope while injustice continues. But the story of Jesus reminds humanity that temporary power is not eternal power. Empires collapse. Corrupt leaders fall. Systems built entirely on exploitation eventually weaken. But truth continues traveling through generations. Sometimes quietly, sometimes through suffering, sometimes through ordinary people history almost ignores. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The world often searches for salvation through domination, through wealth, through military power, through control. But Jesus revealed another path, the path of truth joined with courage, compassion joined with justice, strength joined with humility. That path still survives today. Everywhere people resist corruption with integrity. Everywhere people defend human dignity despite pressure. Everywhere people refuse to surrender their conscience completely to fear. The truth about Jesus remains alive there. No government can fully destroy it. No propaganda can fully erase it. No institution can fully imprison it. Because it survives inside the deepest moral instincts of humanity itself. And perhaps that is why the world still struggles with him after all these centuries. Because the real Jesus continues challenging every generation. He challenges greed, challenges hypocrisy, challenges fear, challenges indifference. And every generation must decide whether to ignore that challenge or respond to it. I believe humanity now stands at one of those moments again. A moment requiring moral courage. A moment requiring truth. A moment requiring human beings to remember one another's dignity before hatred and greed destroy more lives. This is not only a Christian issue, it is a human issue. Because whenever truth disappears, humanity suffers. Whenever dignity disappears, violence grows. Whenever conscience sleeps, corruption spreads. Jesus fought against these realities during his lifetime, and the spirit of that struggle continues even now. Not through perfect people, not through flawless institutions, but through ordinary human beings trying to choose truth over fear. That is why I still believe hope exists for the world. Hope for Africa. Hope for humanity. Because as long as even a small number of people continue defending truth, justice, compassion, and dignity, the spirit of Jesus remains alive. And what remains alive cannot be buried forever. Tonight, I did not speak to you as a perfect man. I spoke to you as a human being searching for truth in a world filled with noise, fear, manipulation, and suffering. I spoke as an African son who has seen struggle closely, as a leader who understands pressure, and as a believer who refuses to accept that greed and corruption must define the future of humanity forever. The truth about Jesus was never meant to make people sleep peacefully inside injustice. It was meant to awaken conscience, to awaken courage, to awaken compassion, and perhaps that is why the world has always struggled with him. Because the real Jesus forces humanity to confront itself honestly. He forced nations to confront hypocrisy. He forces leaders to confront responsibility. He forces ordinary people to confront fear. And that confrontation is uncomfortable. But healing always begins with truth. A wounded world cannot heal through lies. A divided humanity cannot survive forever through greed. And a civilization that forgets human dignity eventually destroys itself from within. Today, many people feel hopeless. Wars continue. Corruption spreads. Families suffer. Young people lose direction. Entire nations struggle under debt, exploitation, and instability. Sometimes darkness appears stronger than light. But history teaches another lesson. Truth survives longer than fear. Compassion survives longer than hatred. And human dignity survives longer than oppression. That is why I still believe in hope. Not blind hope. Not empty slogans. Real hope born from conscience. The hope that human beings can still choose truth over propaganda. Justice over greed. Mercy over cruelty. Courage over silence. I especially speak now to Africa. Africa must never believe the lie that it was created only to suffer. Our people carry strength, wisdom, faith, humanity. We must reject corruption inside ourselves as strongly as we reject exploitation from outside ourselves. Because freedom without integrity cannot survive. And I speak also to the world beyond Africa. To every person listening in America, Europe, Asia, Latin America, and everywhere else. We are not enemies by nature. Ordinary people across the world share the same tears, the same fears, and the same hopes for their children. The systems of greed benefit when humanity remains divided. But truth reminds us of our shared dignity. That is why the message of Jesus still matters. Not because of politics, not because of institutions, but because truth still matters. Human dignity still matters. Love still matters. Compassion still matters. And conscience still matters. So tonight I ask you for something simple. Look honestly at your own heart. If hatred lives there, release it. If greed lives there, confront it. If fear controls your life, challenge it. Return to what is good. Return to truth. Return to compassion. Protect the weak instead of exploiting them. Speak honestly instead of hiding behind silence. Defend dignity wherever you see it attacked. And never allow this world to convince you that corruption is normal or that justice is impossible. Because every generation must decide what kind of humanity it will become. If these words touched your spirit, keep this conversation alive. Share your thoughts, share your reflections, and continue seeking truth with courage and humility. Because silence helps darkness grow, but honest voices help awaken the world. And if you wish, continue walking with us by listening again, reflecting deeply, and keeping these conversations alive for future generations. I speak these words not for fame, not for applause, but because conscience demands truth. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and I speak these words because truth must never fear the world. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and I speak these words because conscience cannot remain silent forever. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and before God and humanity, I tell you these things as truth.